The text arrived at 11:43 p.m., casual enough to feel rehearsed. Need space, in Cabo with my boss. Don't wait up, no punctuation where it mattered, no question mark. No apology. The message didn't ask permission, it issued a weather report. I read it twice, not because I didn't understand it, but because understanding felt like something that happened after the body caught up. I didn't reply. That part surprises people when they hear the story later. They expect rage, or pleading, or at least a demand for clarification. What they don't expect is silence, not the sulking kind, but the quiet that comes when a sentence finally explains years of smaller ones. I set the phone face down and sat there until the room lost its edges. I thought of the dinners rescheduled, the calls taken outside, the way work had begun to sound like a place I wasn't allowed to enter. I thought of how often I'd waited, and how rarely she'd noticed. By morning, the shock had cooled into something more precise. I didn't decide to leave my marriage that day. I decided to stop pretending I was in it. The next week unfolded without drama. That was the strangest part. I went to work. I made coffee. I slept. In the spaces between, I made appointments. The lawyer's office smelled like lemon cleaner and paper. He spoke carefully, the way people do when they're used to translating emotion into process. We talked about statutes, about what was joint and what wasn't, about timelines that favored neither anger nor forgiveness. "This won't be quick," he said. "I'm not," I replied. The banker was efficient. Numbers slid across the screen and rearranged themselves into clarity. Accounts closed. Accounts split. Nothing hidden, nothing theatrical. The law has a way of turning personal collapse into columns and signatures. The real estate agent walked the house with me on a Tuesday afternoon. She admired the light. She asked when I wanted to list. "As soon as possible," I said. She nodded, already thinking in dates. I moved through the rooms that evening and noticed how little I felt compelled to preserve. I packed books I'd brought into the marriage and left the ones we'd bought together. I took the chair that fit my back and left the sofa we'd argued over. The house resisted sentiment once I stopped asking it to cooperate. By the time her plane lifted off the tarmac in Cabo, the listing was live. I booked my flight the night the first offer came in. Europe wasn't an escape plan. It was a line drawn far enough away that habit couldn't erase it. I chose a city where my language would be clumsy and my routines unearned. A place that required paperwork and patience. Distance that had to be maintained, not just imagined. I left the keys on the counter. I left a folder with copies of everything, documents, receipts, timelines. I left a note with no adjectives. All communication can go through counsel. That was it. The plane felt heavier than it should have, or maybe I did. Somewhere over the Atlantic, the enormity of what I'd done pressed in. Not fear. Responsibility. You can't make irreversible choices without paying attention to the weight they add. When I landed, the city met me with indifference. Trams ran on time. Cafes opened when they said they would. No one knew me well enough to ask what I'd lost. 3 days later, she landed. I know because the building manager emailed me. Not to complain. Just to confirm that I no longer resided there, and that access would need to be coordinated through the agent. He added, almost apologetically, that there had been a disturbance. She started screaming before she reached the door. That's how he put it. Not angry shouting. Screaming. The sound people make when expectation snaps and the ground fails to show up where it's supposed to be. She screamed because the house was empty. Because the accounts were closed. Because the future she'd assumed would wait had been packed up, documented, and sent elsewhere without ceremony. She screamed because something she'd treated as renewable had turned out to be finite. I read the email twice, then archived it. In the weeks that followed, messages arrived in waves. First confusion, then accusation, then a version of tenderness I recognized too late to trust. I didn't respond. The lawyer did when response was required. That distance wasn't punishment, it was accuracy. There was nothing left to clarify between us that a process couldn't handle better. I rented a small apartment near the river. The windows opened inward. The neighbors nodded without curiosity. I learned the rhythm of the grocery store, the hours when the cafe downstairs, filled with smoke and conversation I couldn't yet parse. At night, I thought about what I'd taken from her. The easy answer was money, or property, or control. But those were recoverable. She had a job, connections, a life that would reassemble itself around new assumptions. What she couldn't get back was the belief that patience was endless. The certainty that I would be there to receive whatever version of herself she returned with. The comfort of thinking that damage could always be addressed later. That belief had been expensive. I'd paid for it with years. One afternoon, while waiting for a document to be notarized, I caught my reflection in the glass. I looked older than I expected. Not diminished, just marked. The kind of face that knows where the exits are. I won't pretend there was no loneliness. There were evenings when the quiet pressed too hard, when I missed the shorthand of shared history, even the flawed kind. There were mornings when starting over felt less like freedom and more like labor. Self-respect, I learned, doesn't arrive with applause. It comes with invoices. When the sale finalized, the agent sent a photo of the empty house. Sunlight on bare floors. No trace of us except the way the rooms still remembered being occupied. I closed the image without ceremony. The last message from her came months later. It was shorter. Calmer. Acknowledging, finally, that what had happened couldn't be undone. She asked if I was happy. I didn't answer that either. Happiness wasn't the point. Stability was. Honesty. The ability to wake up without rehearsing explanations. On my first anniversary in the new city, I walked across the bridge at dusk and watched the lights come on one by one, uncoordinated and inevitable. I thought about how easy it is to mistake endurance for obligation, and how dangerous it is to let someone else define the cost of your waiting. I had taken something from her that night she texted me from Cabo. Not out of spite, and not to teach a lesson. I took myself out of circulation. And that, I knew as the river kept moving under the bridge, was the one thing she could never get back.